Welcome back to Chapter 27, Part 2, as we continue looking at World War II. This time we'll be focusing on the European and North African theaters of war. Whereas Hitler had kind of planned for a mobile war, one where he would deliver quick and punishing blows to overrun Europe, France, on the other hand, kind of remembered the old trench warfare of World War I and planned to try to build what became known as the Maginot Line, this elaborate system of defenses that stretched kind of the German and French borders. And they spent millions upon millions of dollars, and it really didn't do anything to stop the Germans, because once Germany went to invade France, they just went through the lowlands of Belgium to strike towards Paris and eventually overrun France within several weeks. And even though Hitler was able to quickly overrun France, perhaps one of his biggest mistakes happened at the port town of Dunkirk along the English Channel, where basically these British and French soldiers were kind of holed up, and the onslaught of the Germans had advanced so quickly that they had kind of surrounded these soldiers at Dunkirk. And over the period of roughly a week, anything that could float, rowboats, tugboats, fishing boats, anything was used to try to ferry these soldiers from Dunkirk over to England. And basically they had to leave behind much of their artillery and heavy equipment and arms. But if Hitler would have maybe have acted quicker, he could have captured these men before they escaped. So this is one of the largest evacuations probably in history. And shortly thereafter, France will basically fall and kind of be ran by Hitler and a puppet government that has to kind of obey his orders and kind of work with the Germans will be established. And after France is defeated, Hitler will turn his attention to Britain. In what becomes known as the Blitz, it was an aerial assault that continued day after day and night after night, where the German airplanes would fly overhead and bomb first military targets, but eventually civilian centers as well, and places even like London. And it became so bad that many people moved to the countryside to live or send their kids out to live with other family members, and others had to even go down to the tube. These kind of subway stations to maybe sleep to avoid the bombing of the German Luftwaffe. But Hitler wasn't able ever to invade directly with his army until he had air superiority, and that he never got because of the British RAF, or Royal Air Force. Even some Americans had kind of volunteered because we still weren't in the war yet to fly for the RAF. And using a relatively new invention, the radar, they were able to kind of pick up on these German airplanes crossing the English Channel and going out to try to meet them and battle them over the open seas before they were able to drop their payloads on the different cities and targets throughout Great Britain. Even the Prime Minister at this time, Winston Churchill, credited these airmen for their defense of Great Britain. But as the Blitz continued, Britain had trouble trying to keep their industry going and war supplies, kind of rolling off the lines. And so what eventually happens is, because they're so desperately in need of war materials, eventually Congress and FDR pass the Lend-Lease Act, which replaces the old cash and carry policy. And basically it made it easier for our allies, of which our greatest ally was Great Britain, to try to get the supplies that they were so in desperate need of. Otherwise, if they fell, who would be there to stop Hitler? And through the Lend-Lease Act, you can kind of see how many billions of dollars of goods and money we kind of gave to the Allied powers to try to keep them from falling to these aggressor nations. But another major mistake of Hitler's took place in June of 1941, when he actually breaks his non-aggression pact with the Russians and actually invades into their territory. Now he's able to evade very quickly and very deep into Russian-held lands as he's looking for oil and other natural resources. But what happens is as the Russians are retreating, they're really not putting up any fight. And they're just kind of drawing the Germans further and further into their territory before Stalin gives the orders to put up a stand in Stalingrad, which you can kind of see is kind of on that right side of the map there. And in what becomes kind of the turning point on this front, Stalingrad really proves to be a decisive defeat for Hitler and his men, for they advanced so quickly, so far that when the tough winter of 42-43 set in, his men really weren't as well equipped as they would have hoped. And eventually you can see, both sides had over 1 million men fighting and how many artilleries and tanks were involved. But not only the battle, but the fighting conditions were brutal. House to house and corner, to corner, street to street. And eventually Stalingrad is the turning point from where the Russians will kind of start to kind of push back towards Germany and continue kind of taking back the land that they had once lost. And to make matters, even tougher for Germany, about 6 months after invading the Soviet Union, the Germans had yet another nation to worry about, the United States. For on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched their attack upon Pearl Harbor, trying to knock our naval fleet out to try to give them basically free reign around the Pacific to try to go and continue their expansionism and looking for yet more natural resources. But they knew they couldn't do that if our Navy was intact. And so now we have the big three: Churchill, FDR, and Joseph Stalin. And we're kind of closer allies with Britain, but we had a kind of a distrusting partnership with the Soviets. We had different ideologies, democracy versus communism. But at the same time, we also kind of differed on, kind of battle tactics. We differed on where and when to open a second front against Germany. And much to Stalin's dismay, American troops first entered combat against the Germans in North Africa rather than in Europe, where Stalin had wanted it. We send our forces to aid General Montgomery and the British in defeating the Desert Fox, General Rommel of Germany. And kind of the turning point here in North Africa happens at El Alamein as Rommel was trying to head east through Egypt to obtain some oil fields and was eventually repelled by Montgomery and the United States. Next, the U.S. kind of turned to what's known as kind of the soft underbelly of Europe, and that would be Italy. And under the command of General George Patton, he leads American troops kind of up that boot, where eventually Rome will be liberated in June of 1944. So I'm kind of fast forwarding here a little bit from the time we enter for sake of time, but we do have success in Italy, and eventually Mussolini will be captured and executed. But probably the greatest invasion in the history of warfare happened at D-Day, the beaches of Normandy, known as Operation Overlord, and commanded by the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight David Eisenhower. And on that day, of which we'll talk about more in class, over 156,000 men, of which roughly 73,000 were Americans, stormed the beaches at Normandy. They had the support of over 12,000 aircraft, nearly 7,000 vessels, of which 1,200 were combat ships, and with different brigades landing at different beaches. There was all sorts of mayhem because of the rough seas and the German defenses that were in place. But when it was all said and done, they held their land and they moved ashore under horrible, terrible fighting conditions. And as they made their progress, they were able to liberate Paris within 3 months. So Hitler was right that if he gave up any land to the Allies, it was only going to be a matter of time, and that's why he really tried to defend them, keep them from getting any land by building what he called the Atlantic Wall. However, once the Allies had come ashore and started moving in towards Germany, Hitler did give one more kind of counterattack, which happened in Belgium and became known as the Battle of the Bulge. In that winter, with snow and freezing temperatures, Hitler kind of brought his men, concentrated them into one area to try to make one more push towards the English Channel and drive the Allies back. Now he had some success before the Allies were able to stop the Germans and kind of make them retreat back towards Germany. And so with the Soviet soldiers moving in from the east and the British and Americans moving in from the west, it was only a matter of time before the war in Europe was over. And eventually what happens is that Hitler will commit suicide with his wife in an underground bunker. But eventually, once the Allies converge on Berlin, the war does end on May 8th, 1945, in what becomes known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe. However, that's only part of the war, because we still have to turn our attention to what was going on in the Pacific. And that's what we'll take a look at in our next episode.